Does America really have a godly heritage? Did you realize that most of the 55 founding fathers who worked on the Constitution were members of Orthodox Christian churches, and many were even evangelical Christians? We don't hear that part of our history anymore. This 1856 Maryland history textbook contains a story about George Washington that you've probably never heard. It's a story of how Washington's life hung in the balance for over 2 hours and how that only by the direct intervention of God was it spared. We'll get to this story in just a moment. This story of George Washington once appeared in virtually every student text in America, but hasn't been seen in 40 years. This story deals with George Washington when he was involved in the French and Indian War as a young man of only 23 years of age. The French and Indian War occurred 20 years before the American Revolution. It was the British against the French, and the Americans sided with the British, and most of the Indians sided with the French. Both Great Britain and France disputed each other's claims of ownership along the Ohio and the Mississippi rivers. Both of them claimed the same land. Unable to settle the dispute diplomatically, Great Britain sent 2,300 hand-picked veteran British troops to America under General Edward Braddock to rout the French. The British troops arrived in Virginia, where George Washington was colonel of the Virginia militia, and he and 100 Virginia buckskins joined General Braddock. They divided their force, and General Braddock, George Washington, and 1,300 troops marched north to expel the French from Fort Duquesne, now the city of Pittsburgh. On July the 9th, 1755, only 7 miles from the fort, while marching through a wooded ravine, they walked right into an ambush. The French and Indians opened fire on them from both sides. But these were British veterans. They knew exactly what to do. The problem was they were veterans of European wars. European warfare was all in the open. One army lined up at one end of an open field, the other army lined up at the other end. They looked at each other, they took aim, and they fired. No running, no hiding. But here they were in the Pennsylvania woods with the French and Indians firing at them from both sides, from the tops of trees and from behind rocks and from under logs. But when they came under fire, the British troops did exactly what they'd been taught. They lined up shoulder to shoulder in the bottom of that ravine, and they were slaughtered. At the end of 2 hours, 714 of the 1,300 British and American troops had been shot down. Only 30 of the French and Indians had been shot. There were 86 British and American officers involved in that battle, and at the end of the battle, George Washington was the only officer who had not been shot down off his horse. He was the only officer left on horseback. Following this resounding defeat, Washington gathered the remaining troops and they retreated back to Fort Cumberland in western Maryland. They arrived there on July the 17th, 1755, and the next day, Washington wrote a letter to his family explaining that after the battle was over, he had taken off his jacket and had found 4 bullet holes through his jacket, yet not a single bullet had touched him. Several horses had been shot from under him, but he had not been harmed. He told them, "By the all-powerful dispensations of Providence, I've been protected beyond all human probability or expectation." Washington openly acknowledged that God's hand was upon him, that God had protected him and kept him through that battle. However, the story does not stop here. 15 years later in 1770, now a time of peace, George Washington and a close personal friend, Dr. James Craik, returned to those same Pennsylvania woods. An old Indian chief from far away, having heard that Washington had come back to those woods, traveled a long way just to meet him. He sat down with Washington, and face to face over a council fire, the chief told Washington that he had been a leader in that battle 15 years earlier, and that he had instructed his braves to single out all the officers and shoot them down. Washington had been singled out, and the chief explained that he personally had shot at Washington 17 different times, but without effect. Believing Washington to be under the care of the Great Spirit, the chief instructed his braves to cease firing at him. He then told Washington, "I've traveled a long and weary path that I might see the young warrior of the great battle. I am come to pay homage to the man who is the particular favorite of heaven and who can never die in battle." That account appeared in American history textbooks for nearly a century and a half. Today, it has disappeared.